You send me a link later, right?
Huh?
You'll send me a link later.
Yeah. Here we go. I think we're on. Fabio Magrini, welcome.
Andrew Shepard, hello, thank you.
Great. You are a...
You send me a link later, right?
Yeah, I will. So you are
a link later.
You are a clinical researcher, and you you have had this coronavirus yourself in this spring. Can you tell us a little bit about how that was, how that how that affected you?
Yes, it's been a journey, and it's still somewhat ongoing. I guess I belong to that category, emerging category of coronavirus patients that have prolonged symptoms, somewhat non-typical. And over this journey, I got to meet and speak to a number of people that had the same experience as I did. So for me, it's been now since March that I've been kind of working with this thing. First, it was a struggle. Now it's kind of coming to a resolution stage, but it's still kind of a, on and off. I feel mostly fine, but if I stretch myself too much, if I do too much, if I get too active, then I pay for it. And either I feel out of breath again, or I need to take a break. I feel a little bit feverish again. So, what happened to me was that I had flu-like symptoms at the very beginning of March. These flu-like symptoms kept worsening, but I didn't have any significant cough, which is supposed to be one of the hallmarks of coronavirus. But I had like congestion, and pretty much earlier on, I completely lost my sense of smell and taste. So the weeks were going on, I wasn't feeling better, and I actually then started struggling breathing. I found that taking a full breath became more and more difficult. And that got really bad, really, really bad, to the point that I was going to bed and, wondering whether I would wake up the following morning. It was quite scary. On top of that, my blood pressure started really spiking up, and my heart rate started speeding up. And that is the reason why I had to go to hospital eventually. I couldn't get any help from my doctor. They kept putting me off because my symptoms weren't severe enough to warrant me going to a hospital. I eventually got a coronavirus test after about a month and a half since the beginning of the first symptoms. And clearly it was negative at that point. So eventually, when my blood pressure started getting very bad, I kept trying to ask for help from my doctor. But again, there wasn't very much in terms of response. Remember that this was when everything was really shut down. That there was no in-person activity for the most part anyway. And I was judged to be just, overreactive at that point. It gets so bad that my blood pressure, one morning I woke up and my heart rate was 120 beats when I woke up. And I felt so sick, and I couldn't really take one single full breath. And I felt so sick that I eventually went into hospital. And finally, at the hospital, I was reassured that this wasn't me being anxious or overreactive. It was a real thing. And it was a pattern that they observed before with coronavirus patients. They put me in the COVID-19 ward. They took a test, and again, it was negative, but the infective medicine physician was positive that my pattern fit with what she started seeing on coronavirus patients. So I went back. I soon started feeling better. At this point, I had been sick for like a month and a half, of which 3 or 4 weeks were really bad. And then I started feeling a little better. I started breathing a little better. I started having a little more energy. The beginning of my recovery really was when I started smelling and tasting things again. And that's when, you know, things started getting progressively better. But again, always like, you know, in this like 2 steps forward, 1 step back type of pattern. So now I've been fairly good, fingers crossed, for about 2 or 3 weeks. I'm actually gardening again. I'm active. I can speak to people for more than a couple of hours. I'm being very active at work. But still, if I do too much, in the evening, I kind of struggle a little bit with my breath. I need to be careful because my blood pressure still seems to be kind of going on and off at times. So I'm having a lot of assessments. I'm very happy that my lung function has completely recovered. So I was quite bad at some point, and now I'm kind of back to normal, pretty much. I'm taking it a day at a time, really, and kind of being grateful for every little progress. So it has been now coming 2-3 months, and I'm still not 100%, but I'm probably about 85% back there. I think the first time we spoke, I told you that I was like 50-50, right?
Yep.
So, and that was about a month ago.
Well, congratulations on getting back to 85.
Thank you. What's interesting is that I actually have observed this pattern with my friend who got sick at the same time as I did. And now there are a number of forums on social media for patients that have been having long-term effects from coronavirus, and it's a growing community. And there are a lot of experiences that mimic and overlap with my own. Overall, I feel like one of the lucky ones because I really haven't had significant lung problems. I know a lot of people that have been having this cough that comes and goes now for 3 or 4 months, and they feel really sick. For me, it's more like a more kind of maybe cardiovascular in nature, more about breathing and blood pressure.
So Fabio, what we've learned at this point now in late June, what do we think the nature of this enemy really is, and have we been underestimating it or just misdiagnosing it so far?
Yeah, this is a little bit of a bigger issue in the sense that it was very apparent to me that from the very beginning of this pandemic, we have been relying on partial information and making that partial information that was available to us a universal truth. So when we started in February, this was pretty much like the cold: 2 weeks of incubation, 2 weeks of disease, 2 weeks of recovery, right? And for a small proportion of patients, 0.2, 0.4 of the patients, especially if they were elderly and debilitated or with concomitant conditions, they had a higher risk of going into respiratory insufficiency, which is pretty much what we know about most respiratory viruses. So we made immediately an assumption that this was a respiratory virus, and all of our responses were based on that piece of knowledge. most respiratory viruses are not airborne, they're transmitted by direct contact. And coronavirus, the kind of common coronavirus that is responsible for the common cold, is also transmitted by direct contact. It's not transmitted through the air. So we took that knowledge and we extrapolated it to what we found and what we knew about coronavirus and made it a general rule. Pretty much very quickly, it became apparent that coronavirus binds specifically to a receptor which is responsible for the exchange of oxygen in both lungs and for the response of smooth muscle in both lungs, cardiovascular system, and kidneys. So the renin-angiotensin system, so the receptors of this virus actually influence blood pressure response, cardiovascular response, vascularity, kidney function, and as well as lung function. So the picture that we were seeing of this interstitial pneumonia could be explained both as a response to an immune reaction caused to from the virus and filling up the lungs, or could be explained as almost as a vascular problem, where really the vessels, the interface between oxygen and bloodstream was compromised. We know that now for several months. However, the strategies in treating coronavirus have not changed very much since. So, in spite of acquiring additional knowledge, the evidence generated data that we have, which is mostly from the hospital setting, because most patients that experience coronavirus don't go to hospital or are not seen by a healthcare professional. There is a huge gap between the extreme pictures that we observe and the reality of the situation. That's my impression. So we have a disconnect between what coronavirus really does and how it works, and therefore how we can treat it, versus what coronavirus does in extreme cases, and therefore what are the therapies for those extreme cases, and how can we treat those extreme cases.
So why is this? Why do you think this is that I mean, it seems like we've got all the evidence. Why are we jumping to conclusions so much in one, to one degree or the other? I mean, is this comparable to 1918? I mean, we like to make comparisons, right? Of 1918, 1968, H1N1, we try to make comparisons. And how does that work? How do those comparisons measure up?
Certainly, some comparisons are valid, right? So, for instance, we know from 1918 that the spread of the virus, if it goes unchecked, unless we take containment measures, it will spread very, very widely. However, because we are only concerned, to me, there is a skewed approach to this virus, right? In the sense that we are not worried about the pathology in itself. We are not concerned about the pathology. So, we're not asking the question, what does this virus do to the body? We have been asking the question in terms of, okay, this virus is now with us. How do we limit healthcare resources strains? So so we're not studying the virus as a disease that has different levels of manifestations. We are focusing on the disease as a strain on healthcare resources. So we are only worried about the number of hospitalizations, number of intubators, how many people get oxygen, and how many people die. But in reality, the morbidity of the virus is very different from the mortality of the virus.
Right.
So we don't know the virus because we are not studying it in the correct setting, which is a very heterogeneous setting that goes from, the 90-year-old that has a common cold or a flu and progresses to pneumonia and progresses to death for respiratory insufficiency, to the person that has an immune reaction and proceeds to the same dramatic outcome. But we forget about all the people that sit in between, right? Or we concentrate on people that are only acquiring the infection but don't develop symptoms.
Right.
But everything in between, we don't understand. And therefore, we don't really understand the virus. We don't understand treatments because, again, we intervene in a hospital setting, which is like a last resort type of setting. And we are not preventing people from experiencing, situations like mine or like many others that can progress to a hospital setting.
Right.
We just don't know how long it might take.
So we've got one strategy which isn't wrong, which is to keep the hospitals from being overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not, it's because we're so focused on that, we're not focusing on how to figure this out and how to really understand the deeper nature of this disease so that we can actually defeat it for everybody.
In my opinion, there is a huge influence around how we treat medicine nowadays. Medicine nowadays is not treated as a pure science or a humanistic science. It's more treated as a health economics type model. So diseases are only worth treating when they cause a financial and economic impact. And you measure the impact of those diseases in terms of the cost that they cause. So it's worth treating extreme cases of coronavirus because the hospital costs are so exorbitant and the availability of hospital beds for those kind of conditions is so limited that it creates a strain on the pharmacoeconomic model and on the logistics of the health systems.
Wow. That makes sense. I mean, it looks, I mean, that's what it would look like from what I can see. It's just, I mean, people have been saying this for a little while, that money seems to be driving everything in this country.
Mm-hmm. To be fair, it's not just this country. I think most of the Western pharmacoeconomic model is overlapping. It's all about, how much does it cost us to provide care to people? And what is the boundary between providing care and not providing care from a financial gain perspective?
Yeah. So how should we be approaching this? How do we break down this disease if we were going to do it right? I mean, I know that people are saying, oh, well, certain people are working on a vaccine, so that's sort of our end game. Those are the people who are really going to solve it. We're just sort of holding things back until they can solve our problems.
Right.
But even Fauci and other people have said, it's going to be likely a whole year before we get an antiviral, drug that can actually be widely distributed. So what are we going to do in the meantime when it's ravaging hundreds of thousands of people every week?
Yes, I think that it's a great question. We have this assumption that, oh, right, as long as we hang on waiting for a vaccine, we're going to be fine, right? But again, from previous experience and knowledge on the efficacy of vaccines, we know that vaccines are only efficacious and fully preventing in about, when it comes to respiratory diseases like the flu, they're only effective in probably 50 to 60% of people, you know? So what you want really is a mixture of vaccination and herd immunity. So you have healthy people that develop a natural immunity to the disease because it's so represented in society and in the community that it becomes, you know, part of the background noise that the immune system is able to deal with. And then you have a more vulnerable population where you actually need to intervene and give a vaccine. And that could be the very young and the very old, right? That's normally the approach that we take. The problem with that is that this virus is spreading very quickly. And not only is spreading very quickly, but it has a huge, it's not only very, very infectious, it's also very nasty. It kind of, you know, it attacks a lot of people and it causes physical symptoms in a lot of people. Again, I've been, you know, preparing for this conversation. I've been reading a lot of statistics about, you know, the mortality, morbidity, and death rate, mortality rates of the coronavirus. And I've been shocked that a lot of those calculations that look at, you know, 0.2, 0.4, 0.02%, they're very overlapping to the flu in terms of you know, death rate, mortality rates, are really based on a flawed model, which assumes that this virus is already widely present in the population. If we start looking only at the number, because instead of looking at this from a death versus infection rate, we need to remember that we only have confirmed cases. So those are people that either have symptoms with a positive test or are in a hospital and have a positive test. So this is a subset of the population. So of the over 2 million people that have contracted the infection in the US, over 200,000, approaching 220,000 have died. That is the correct statistic, and that is the correct number. And it should be taken with the awareness that that number is probably underestimating both the number of infections and the number of deaths. Because the test in itself, which is still the Abbott test, which is the same one that the White House uses to screen their personnel, has a high rate of false negatives. So that means that active infections are not picked up. On the other hand, not all patients that get sick make it to the hospital. So for instance, I was talking to my family and they have noticed that they don't know a lot of people that died of coronavirus, but they know an extremely and worrying number of people that died from heart attacks and strokes. And we know that here, there's also been an increase in heart attacks and strokes in the younger population. But those are not being discussed because they don't present in that classical coronavirus respiratory disease pattern that we assume is the correct one.
Okay. So we're misassessing what to look for. And so you're basically, because I keep hearing also these arguments that, oh, we're over-diagnosing people, you know, doctors are being told to call it coronavirus even if it's not what killed them. And I mean, and that seems to be like wrong, right? I mean, if it really didn't directly correspond to their death, then why would that be counted as a coronavirus? But then you have on the other side all these people who are not even being tested for coronavirus who are dying.
Mhm.
And we have, I saw statistics in an article, I think yesterday, that was, we're just like 25% higher death rate for this last period than, than ever. It's like there's just a quarter more deaths across the board. You got to account for that somehow.
And that's inexplicable according to the model. And that's the limitation of the model, which again leads us to a wider discussion of how medicine is done in the 21st century. So because we use what is called, from the 90s, we use what is called evidence-based medicine. So this is a very empirical way to say, I know that a disease is true or a treatment works only because I have an experiment that tells me that that is the truth, right? So my empirical evidence based on randomized clinical trials, based on large reviews of the literature and statistics, tells me that within a population, most of the people whom I know have coronavirus because I tested them, right? So regardless of the positive, negatives, the windows of testing, but, as an assumption, everybody that is coronavirus positive, and in that population, I have roughly 3 or 4 groups that I can identify. But that is, although that statement is not untrue, it's also not completely true, because it does not take into account of all of these variables that affect the test positivity, that might fall through the cracks in the different health systems, that might not be captured in a hastily conducted clinical trial, and so on and so forth. To give an example, there was this thing with hydroxychloroquine. So first, empirical evidence from mostly Italian, Russian, and European doctors say, hydroxychloroquine is used to suppress the immune system. It's an immunoregulator that is used in autoimmune disease. So if I give it to people that have coronavirus, because I believe that the effects of coronavirus are related to a hyperactivation of the immune system, I'm going to make it better. And they observed that some patients actually made it through and some patients didn't. That led them to believe that on the basis of the evidence and the assumption they made and the patient selection that they executed, that was an appropriate approach. Right? But that discounted the fact that if somebody has underlying heart disease and you take hydroxychloroquine, or an acute cardiovascular condition that could be caused by this virus, actually hydroxychloroquine might kill you faster than coronavirus. So it's the problem with evidence-generated medicine or evidence-based medicine is that it has a very short window of observation and a very limited window of observation that only pertains to the specific question that you're asking. So the answer you get is completely dependent on the question.
Right. It's essentially like push polling in politics or something. You're basically saying, hey, did you know that so-and-so did such and such? And like you're basically planting the framework, or it's, or you could, that the people are then going to believe, or you could think about it in sort of like a political war strategy. He who sets the rules wins the game. Right. We're basically framing it up, and that's all we're going to see is through that lens.
So you might set up an investigation to say, I want to see if this thing is efficacious. And you might find that it is efficacious. But then if you discount the safety, right? So if you don't ask also the question whether it is safe and in what populations is efficacious versus others, you miss out a lot, right? On the other hand, what makes it worse here is also that we have a belief system where not only, we're talking about coronavirus as a disease, but also we have an entrenched belief system that says, if this matches what I know to be already, there is no point in me questioning whether this does something else, unless I fail at everything that I do.
Right.
Right.
And that's the nature of a lot of pharmaceutical drugs, right? It's like, well, if it works, why if it's not broke, don't fix it.
Right. And it's the nature of the health system, right? Exactly that. If it isn't broken, why fix it? And that's what, for instance, in the US, why you have such a kind of rampant rate of comorbidities that get unchecked. And so many people, taking hundreds, tens of medications without any significant changes to lifestyles, without any significant changes to, kind of diet or any kind of long-term change. On the other hand, you have the opposite then of the dogmatic approach to medicine, where you have like this almost magical thinking where we say, oh, if I decide that coronavirus it doesn't exist, and I just take supplements that kind of support my immune system, I'm not going to get it. And if I get it, I'm not going to die from it.
Right. Which is, go ahead.
Which is, the other way of looking at it, right? So there is feeling and proof. Both of them are limited because none of them gives you a complete picture.
Right. So how do we get into the right frame of mind, the right place of really studying the disease in its entirety, and really being strategic about this?
Exactly. We need to become, I think that you use the key word, we need to become strategic rather than reactive. So far we've been reactive. And again, people blame Fauci, for instance, because at the beginning of the crisis, he said we don't need masks. Now he's kind of use a mask, and people rightly say, well, what has changed is the same virus. If before it was okay not to use a mask and just wash your hands, and now you tell us to use a mask, what's the value of that, right? Because there is no appreciation that actually we should have known, and actually observation of the pattern of infection should have suggested, and probably did, that this wasn't a virus that was transmitted only by direct contact or through droplets, but it actually had an airborne component.
Right.
We knew that already, but we didn't have the direct evidence that allowed us to make a definite statement from a scientific perspective. So we couldn't have, because again, evidence-based medicine is completely entrenched in our system, and anything outside of that is completely discounted. Even if the suspicion was there, it could not even be mentioned because it would have been discredited immediately.
Because we have no hard evidence telling us directly this is airborne.
Right.
So we're just like, well, we don't know, but so for now, don't worry about that. If it kills 100,000 people, we'll worry about it then when we've got the evidence.
When we have the evidence. Yes. So we only act in a instead of strategizing, we actually continue to be reactive and adjust to the emerging data.
This is a mindset. And I feel like this is prevalent through the entire culture today. This isn't just in medicine. This isn't just in science. It's spread throughout everybody. I mean, you see it all on social media. Everyone's reactive. If they've got some piece of data that is emotionally upsetting to them, they act on it. But unless there is that emotional cue, it's data. What do I do with it?
It's either hyper-rational or reactive, right? Or hyper-emotional. There is no mediation. And again, this is not a new situation. We had the same, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. We, as a species, we keep going through phases where we try and integrate, and then we separate again. So, and now we are, as a society, we are at a point of a pretty much complete segregation of the empirical versus rationalistic, thought pattern, which is different. Let's not confuse rationalistic with a rational, right? It's different. Rationalistic doesn't mean rational necessarily.
Explain that difference.
So the main difference is that empiricism uses a thought process called deductive. So we only acquire knowledge through prior knowledge. So the more we know, the more we're going to know. So this is why I know that coronavirus is part of a coronavirus family. Coronavirus family is respiratory viruses. Respiratory viruses behave in a certain way, right? Rationalism is Galenus, the first to integrate this into a medical system, these two systems into a medical thinking, called them dogmatics. They base everything on observation and on the moment feeling. It relies very much on ancient knowledge, which is left unchallenged. It's very much dogmatic in the sense that it relies on belief rather than observation. And at the time of Galenus, those two systems were employed equally by physicians with very bad effects in both cases. So Galenus came in and said, maybe we need a little bit of both, right? We need the intuitive, inductive process to look at patterns, to interpret broader strategic, broader reactions. And then we need the evidence generation to tell us that the hypothesis that we are forming is indeed true. And that is basically the basis, that way of thinking is the basis of the scientific method that was then later developed by Sir Francis Bacon. So, it's taken about 1800 years from Galenus to Bacon, and now it's taken us essentially 50 years from the rising of evidence-generated medicine to be where we are now, where we completely discount any kind of clinical judgment.
So in other words, we're talking about, when you're talking about rationalism, you're talking about intuition and sort of personal experience or wisdom with it, general wisdom that's not necessarily evidence-based. It's what has worked in the past. And that's sort of part of the intuitive system of a human being is to, a doctor with 30 years of experience would go, yeah, that's what the machine is reading, but something tells me this is this, because
Right.
There's something about all of these symptoms in concert that tells me it's something else.
Yes.
And sometimes they're right because their intuition is so well trained.
Right.
But sometimes they're wrong, which means lawsuit, death, that form of medicine shunned and shamed out of existence.
Well, and that's again, it's different from a completely deductive system to a completely inductive system, right? So one relies on hard evidence, the other one relies only on reason in the classical sense of reason, which is my thinking process, my belief system, my understanding and knowledge of reality from my own personal individual perspective. So one of it generalizes everything. The other one is strictly and completely individualistic and not based on any kind of you know, relatable evidence.
And so we've got these two different systems, and you're saying that they've pretty much been pulled apart.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very much, I believe.
And is the solution putting them, I mean, is in your mind, putting them back together is what we need, right? Because you can deduct from a number of different pieces of evidence a certain amount of things, but what you're saying is that we need more intuition here to actually ask the right questions, because we're not asking the right questions yet.
I think it's a question of acknowledging. So the first step, in my opinion, is acknowledging the limitations of the system, right? So let's take an example. On one hand, you have Western medicine, right, where everything now is on a protocol. So most physicians do operate on very standard measures. So as an example, I'm 55, you know, let's say I start developing urinary symptoms. I go to the doctor, they find out that my prostate is enlarged, and they put me on finasteride, which is an androgen inhibitor that prevents prostate cancer, right? So I start taking this, and all of a sudden, my chest, my breast start growing, because one of the side effects of finasteride is to cause gynecomastia. So the growth, which is the growth of female breasts on men.
Oh, wow.
So it develops the mammary glands. Then at that point, I stop going out, I stop going to the gym, I stop being active. And because of my age group and because of my, I end up dying of cardiovascular disease instead of you know, prostate cancer. But it is protocol to administer that treatment in any way. It's guidelines, right? Or the other example would be with statins, right? So if you have cholesterol above a certain level, I think it's 140, you would be prescribed statins, because statins, in a large study conducted in the 90s, proved to decrease a risk of cardiovascular disease. So anyone with high cholesterol would be put on statins. However, statins can cause osteoporosis, can cause a number of additional side effects. So as an example, you have a 70-year-old woman, diabetic, that comes with high cholesterol, which is not unusual for diabetics, and they will get statins. That means that that statin might precipitate osteoporosis and basically ultimately drive her to the grave because of the unintended side effect of the drug.
But to the clinicians, they're basically getting the evidence that they want back, that the original disease was prevented by the drug.
At a group level, not at an individual level. And the guidelines apply to individuals as if they were groups, right? So you're not talking about if somebody is 71-year-old, they had diabetes, they are diabetics, and their cholesterol is 140. Don't give statins, but give statins to somebody who's 35, overweight, not diabetic yet, they're not at risk of osteoporosis. Give them statins because they might prevent cardiovascular disease that occurs more frequently between the third and fifth decade of life, right? is not individualized. It assumes that all people, all individuals belong to the same group, right? So that is the problem with kind of Western medicine, that we have all those guidelines that are conducted, almost blindly. So the medical profession now, it's about following protocols that have been vetted and established across groups of people, large clinical trials, large observational studies, without really understanding the differences between individuals within the same group. That could also, provide additional benefits as well as additional risks. So it doesn't tell you who's going to particularly benefit from statins and who's going to be particularly not benefiting from statins. It just tells you that statins are okay in this group. So that's the problem.
Not good enough. So we're like resting on our laurels and being like, the health insurance companies are satisfied defending this in court because we've got empirical evidence to support this theory of medicine, but no one's digging deeper to ask the questions: how do we get more pinpoint accurate with the administration of this drug? How do we solve the problems that are on the table? How do we actually not just, that's not broke, don't fix it? How do we actually figure out medicine to the point where we're solving these diseases?
And that is why, since the 90s, this is not an unknown problem. Essentially, what we are doing, we are treating populations instead of individuals. So health organizations and payers are okay with that because overall, most people get a benefit, right? Overall, from a population perspective, 50% of the people still get better, right? So at a population level, it does make sense. It doesn't make sense at an individual level.
But this is because it's coming through the lens of a health insurance company with whom everything is about risk assessment in a large statistical body of evidence. Like, that's how their whole model of business works.
It's not just, to be clear, it's not just US insurance companies.
No, but just health insurance in general.
Right. It's the same for national health systems. Okay. It's the same everywhere. And again, it's this kind of pharmacoeconomic model about, efficacy or, effectiveness rather than efficacy, right? So it's at a group level, are most people going to benefit from this drug or from this treatment or not, right? So if the answer is yes, we do that. So this is a problem that is known both in the pharmaceutical industry, but also in the medical profession. And that's why over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of efforts in what we call personalized healthcare. So how do we identify people that will benefit from certain treatments rather than others? And what's interesting is that there's been huge investment, both from a private and public sector. There is a huge NIH initiative, the CDC, FDA, all of the government agencies are, throwing money into this initiative. I don't know if you remember, but for instance, there was a huge push at the end of the Obama administration, sponsored actually by Joe Biden, in oncology, about creating personalized healthcare in oncology. There was like a huge government investment in that field. The problem is that when you try to apply personalized healthcare using an evidence-based model, the two are almost incompatible, because you can't personalize an approach that is based on group statistics, right? It's almost impossible. And again, the difference between to implement personalized healthcare, we need to admit that there is something that we don't fully understand or that we can't fully measure about the reasons why certain people respond and others don't to a certain treatment, versus the fact that in evidence-based medicine, we must assume that all that we know at a given moment is completely truth and accurate.
And that doesn't work. That doesn't work. Well, what's the right way to do this? I mean, it sounds to me like you're suggesting that what we should be doing is taking the evidence and then asking a ton of questions and spinning it around and going like, well, how might that be working? Like, are there 3 other ways that this might actually be correlated to the disease at hand, rather than assuming, oh, well, that's causing it, because that's evident every time. Like, well, that's correlative, yes, but it's not necessarily causative, and let's keep looking for other things to fit.
It's the intuitive or it's the inductive step. So the scientific method assumes that the first step in a scientific investigation is an inductive one, is the formulation of a hypothesis.
Right.
And the scientific method is the process by which, trying to invalidate that hypothesis, you confirm it as truth. And you can tell very quickly that that is very different from the state of the matter right now, where we only do research based on prior knowledge without formulating a novel, or at least a completely novel hypothesis, because we always apply it to existing models.
So we're basically taking imagination and intuition out of the scientific method altogether, which makes it a crippled beast.
Which makes the assumptions limited. You know, it's not crippled in the sense that it works, right? If you say, if it's true that what you know is true, right? It works really well with antibiotics, for instance, because you know how infectious diseases work. You know how to measure whether a bacteria is still in your body and it's not, right? So you know exactly whether your treatment is efficacious or not. And that's why antibiotics or anti-infectives have a higher success rate than most other molecules. But when you go into chronic degenerative disease, there is very little difference between new molecules that have been developed. That's very little difference, and there's been very little improvement over the last 40, 50 years, because by applying the same assumptions and the same measurements across all those molecules, instead of evaluating the merit of the singularities of the disease and the medicine, you fail to create a personalized approach or an individualized approach to the disease. So we make general rules and they apply them blindly to everybody, right? And that's why I was saying the solution is actually to start recognizing the limitations of the methods that we use. Remember how the scientific method was devised in the first place. On the other hand, we have all this kind of flurry of magical thinking and alternative healthcare, where everything is guided by intuition or belief, right? And you have the same problem where not everybody responds, and not everybody gets better, and not everybody, understands, for instance, in the case of coronavirus, that this is a true virus. It's not, there is no emotional response associated to a virus. The virus doesn't have the ability to discern whether somebody is woke or not, right? So, you know, and then it creates a different belief system that you don't have to wear a mask, that you don't have to do this, you don't have to do that. And it still relies on false or partial assumptions, but instead of trying to scientify them or kind of justify them on the basis of actual data, takes them out of context and creates a belief system around that. Right? So this legend that coronavirus only affects elderly people or the vulnerable populations is used by deniers to say, you know, either this is a necessity that the elderly must die, or that I'm healthy, I don't need to worry about coronavirus because it's not going to hit me. When again, you know, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, there is a huge chunk of patients from coronavirus that are in the 30s and 40s and 50s with no prior conditions that have been struggling for weeks and months to recover a parvens of normality to their lives.
Right.
And, you know, yes, I didn't die. Yes, I am, you know, I'm very lucky, and I actually learned a lot about myself and about my body into this process. But I don't wish anyone to get what I got. And I'm really lucky because I still can work from home. I do my own hours, you know, so I've been able to keep my income going. You know, my job doesn't require me to do any physical work and so on and so forth. But a lot of people are not as lucky as I am. And they struggle even more. So
what is your assessment then? Like what are we looking at here with coronavirus? Or at the very least, what kind of questions should we be asking now, given the recent upsurge in numbers and particularly these fewer reported young people infections?
So to me, we should ask three fundamental questions, right? First of all, how the coronavirus really affects the body, and what are the real clinical manifestations of coronavirus, right? Then the second question is, what is the most effective way to treat the effects of coronavirus? Is it intubators, respirators? Probably not, because, you know, maybe respirators and intubators are good, you know, as good as CPR, but, you know, only 5% of patients survive CPR. It's, you know, it's an emergency last resort.
Right.
Right? So how do we intervene earlier? How do we intervene? What are those treatments? You know, if this binds to the ACE receptors, you know, what are those medicines that we have already in our disposals that can help with that?
Like vitamin B2 and zinc.
I also like you know, blood pressure medications, anticoagulants, you know, some kind of muscle relaxants, you know, all different categories of medications that actually facilitate blood flow rather than diminish it. You know, what is the role of steroids? At the beginning of the crisis, steroids, again, you know, steroids at the beginning were like, don't use steroids in these patients because they're going to die much quicker because their immune system is going to be depressed and the virus is going to devastate them. Lately, there's been a paper showing that steroids can actually help with the outcomes if used in the right context. So what we need to do is to look at the science, right? We need to look at the data that is really available to us and be able to not base a judgment only on outcomes, but on hypothesis generating. So we should generate hypotheses and on the basis of these hypotheses, conduct clinical trials that validate those hypotheses,
Right.
even if they're outside of our current understanding of what a coronavirus is. Right? So that's one step. The second one is the fact that it was fully expected that the moment we opened up and relaxed social distancing rules, we would see an increase in infection rates and deaths. It was fully expectable. We didn't want to expect it. We didn't want to consider that possibility because we thought that by slowing down the virus, we could probably get rid of it. And, and that is not how it works.
Yeah.
So instead of what we need to do is to understand what are feasible and livable solutions to dealing with this on a long term, because this is going to stay with us probably for another 18 months. If we act very intelligently, it's going to be with us for another 18 months. So how can we live for the next 18 months? Of course, it's unfeasible for everybody to stay home, and not see anyone for the next 18 months. But there must be ways on which we can change the way we do things so that we can keep doing that, right? So, and again, I'm thinking about our prior experience. This is the empiric piece of information. We know already from the HIV epidemic that by changing sexual behaviors, we have limited the infection spread, but also we have been able to, form, intimate relationships with others without having to be paranoid about HIV all the time, right? We need to find similar solutions for coronavirus. That might mean that, yes, we accept that we wear a mask in public. Yes, we accept that we are not going to hug with strangers. We accept that we create smaller communities, right? And we accept that maybe, the financial market doesn't need to be profit on a very short-term basis, but maybe we need to consider the possibility that we might have to see a shrinking of financial activity, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's a failure, right? So having less profit doesn't mean that we have no profit at all, right? So, and support, from the government and the federal, and from our own taxes that we pay, every year, to actually get some of that money back and be used to keep us a little bit safer. So, there are strategies that we can employ, but creating the strategies is only possible if we all believe in the same things. If we all believe that this is, a disease, this is a virus that needs to be dealt with in a mindful, realistic, rational way, where there is a level of judgment that we must apply. They can't be just black or white. There must be some gray areas that we need to navigate, but without necessarily having to go to the extremes all the time. Right. And the realization that we might be able to limit the risk, but not abolish it completely.
Right. And so another strategy, of course, other than masks and asking doctors to take, to be more, use more hypotheses in their work, would be to isolate in strategic ways, where you're maybe quarantining with a closed circuit of people that don't go outside. They all have the same safety protocols. No one takes more risk than anyone else, and they close the circle, so they're never having they're never exposing themselves to anybody else outside that group without a mask and social distancing.
Right. Really realizing that even that approach can limit the risk, but never eliminates it completely.
Right.
You know?
I had a family member recently was talking about getting a HEPA filter for her office because she, she has a private office, but she, the corridor and everything is shared with all these other people. And she knows that a mask over hours and hours isn't going to do any good against an aerosol virus. So she's going to try to get a HEPA filter, air filter for her office space, so that when she goes into her office, if it's been running for an hour before she arrived, she could reasonably take her mask off when she's in her own office.
Right.
And just put it back on when she goes into the hallway.
Right. And that's, that's a possibility. The other possibility is that, can we move a lot of activities outdoors, instead of kind of gathering in homes or in closed spaces, we do more gathering outside, right? And wearing masks. Again, this is something that I struggle with because it's a message that doesn't seem to get through, Andrew. And that a mask does, especially a face covering like the ones that we're using, right? It doesn't really protect us. It's not to protect ourselves. It's to protect others from the chance that we carry the virus and we don't know that we are.
Right. And it's
Right.
mostly, if it's a cloth mask, you're really just limiting droplets. The aerosol stuff isn't really being limited much at all.
Right. And maybe also, I'm thinking that maybe this is also the way to establish a level of herd immunity, because herd immunity can be more easily established if there is a low level of viral load around, right? It's not, you don't get herd immunity if there are very high levels of viruses, because your immune system, it's unlikely to be able to cope with high viral loads. But low viral loads might be sufficient to stimulate an immune response and create antibodies without triggering a true infection.
Right. So in other words, a mindset of caution and limited exposure,
right.
Meaning cloth face masks help, would kind of become a form of gradual inoculation for people who have strong, robust immune systems. But if you're throwing all caution to the wind, you're like, oh well, when in Rome, I'm in an unsafe party environment, I'm just gonna go maskless and hug everybody and forget that this exists. You're increasing your risk dramatically to get a high viral load, which might actually just knock you flat on your back and possibly kill you.
And chances are that not only that, but the fact that you might become infected, you might become a healthy carrier, and you might transmit it to somebody that might be more susceptible to have a worse outcome than you will.
Right.
So it's also, dealing with, to me, it's a level of understanding that by not observing social distancing or protection rules, it's not that you're just dealing with yourself, you're taking a risk for yourself, you're effectively taking a risk for other people.
Right. You're becoming the weakest link in your community.
Right. And the adjacent communities, right? So you have, let's say you have a bubble of 10 people, all of these 10 people have families that might be outside of their bubbles and relations that might be outside of their bubbles, and so on and so forth. If you're the weakest link within a circle, not only you're going to transmit virus within your circle, but you're more likely to kind of spread it outside to those adjacent bubbles, right? And that's what's happening. For instance, we've seen that it was like birthday parties where everybody gets infected, and other types of gathering where everybody gets infected, and then they spread it out to the community more and more and more, right? And eventually somebody down that link is going to end up dying. So the question that we should ask ourselves is not so much, am I limiting my liberty? But maybe it's, do I want responsible for somebody dying for my lack of caution?
Well, Fabio, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you want to add?
I mean, there is so much to talk about. We only
We'll do another video on getting into the depths of this issue with empiricism versus rationalism, and the lack of integration in the medical and across our society at large. This sort of split of sort of split of the human being and our mental abilities and the whole scientific method.
Right.
We'll get into that.
Yeah, which is to me the kind of core of why we're struggling so much with this. You know, because we seem to be unable to actually find the middle ground where we actually combine the best of two apparently conflicting belief systems that are actually not conflicting at all.
Right.
They're just complementary.
Yeah, I just, that's what I feel about so many of the conspiracy theories that keep coming out. It's like, well, the data doesn't make any sense to me. The data doesn't fit. But the hypothesis in the first place that there's something wrong here, that there's some sort of delusional, conspiratorial, problem, that rings pretty true to me. So I'm like, I love your intuition, don't like your fact checking.
Right.
So it's like we really need the intuitives and the empiricists to get together and work together and within ourselves. We're like okay, I'm feeling this hypothesis bubbling up within me. This is what I'm feeling and I'm guessing. Let me now check my data to make sure that actually fits, and not commit a whole bunch of scientific, cognitive bias errors to basically ensure that it fits, because I keep throwing away everything that denies that theory.
Right. And and that's a big discussion, but one of the big things that we are lost in our society is the combination of scientific and humanistic into the same curriculum for most educational courses. So we don't associate the understanding of technical skills with the understanding of ethics and philosophy, or the understanding of philosophy and religion within the context of a practical approach. So it's kind of it's very disjointed, which doesn't benefit anyone. It benefits certain individuals that are those that generate and kind of trigger and fuel the conspiracy theories.
Right. Well, thank you, Fabio.
Thank you. Pleasure.